So the audience, just so I can get a sense, the folks.
So, good afternoon and welcome to Cornell Policy Review Issues in Public Policy Seminar. We are recording this dialogue. We will be publishing in the social media and other platforms that Cornell Policy Review uses. And the Cornell Policy Review is the flagship journal of the Cornell Institute for Public Affairs. And this idea was developed at the editorial board this year to commence a public dialogue on some of the issues that are very pertinent to public policy making in our times. And the idea is to help us to articulate some of the best ideas, some of the best policy measures we can use to intervene, especially in emergency situations or disaster situations like we have had in the COVID era. We do recognize the place of the World Bank in all that, hence our interest in finding scholars and practitioners linked to that institution to have this conversation and lead us into this dialogue. We are reaching you live from Ithaca, New York, a very fine place, gorgeous with waterfalls and greenery in spring, actually, very beautiful spring sometimes. It could be cold in winter, but we are fine because the ideas we generate here are very warm ideas for public policy development and making. Our speaker today is Sheila Braka Musiime. I hope I got the pronunciation very well. She is a Chief Counsel of the World Bank, having had several portfolios on issues of public policy and law, whether in Africa, in South Asia, or such other emerging markets within the world. Before the World Bank, she had attended Harvard Law School, where she got her LLM in law. She will be managing and speaking to us today, together with her partner, or will I say, associate in the office, Paige Cassidy. Paige, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am Paige Cassidy. As you mentioned, I'm working in Sheila's department, the legal department at the World Bank, on some related COVID issues, and I've worked with her on this presentation. So I'm happy to be here and meet you all.
Thank you, Paige. So our format will be that the speaker will make the opening remarks, and then we will follow with an interactive section, a question and answer section. You can always raise your hand through the apps, or you indicate by sending a message in the chat box, asking your question, and then I can read it out. But meanwhile, we want it to be very interactive, and also we want it to be sharp and crisp. So keep your questions short so that we can accommodate as many people as possible. So with that, and without much ado, I welcome Sheila Braka Musiime to lead us in this conversation about the World Bank in the COVID era, the challenges and some of the policy interventions so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cosmas. Thanks so much for this introduction and for the invitation here. Paige and I are happy to join you, and I want to recognize all the work she's doing at the World Bank on several issues to do with COVID and fragility and all sorts of issues. So we're really happy to be here and to be invited by you. And it's very exciting to be at Cornell. I mean, this is one of the world-renowned universities, with deep thinkers like all of you here. So it's an honor for us to speak here with you. And I hope everybody's doing as well as can be during these unusual times. So I'm very happy to be here to discuss the World Bank's recent work on legal and policy challenges associated with COVID-19. What I will do is I will go over a presentation just to give you a broad landscape of some of the legal issues and policy issues that we've been encountering. And then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. Just before, as I start, I think you all know this, but I just want to make sure I'm clear about who we are, who we represent. So the World Bank Group comprises International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which marked 70 years of its establishment following World War II. We marked that this year. It's also comprised of International Development Association, which is the lending arm of the bank, which was established in 1960 to provide financing to the less developed countries of the world. So IBRD and IDA are where Paige and I work, but the World Bank Group is much broader. It also has International Finance Corporation. It has the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. So it's 5 organizations in one group. The World Bank proper, so I've talked about the World Bank Group. The World Bank proper comprises IBRD and IDA. So the first 2 I talked about, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and International Development Association. But one fun fact, the word the World Bank does not appear anywhere in the Articles of Agreement of either IDA or IBRD. And so maybe some homework after this is for you to find out where the World Bank originated from. But that's what we are commonly known as. Another not so fun fact is that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is not part of the World Bank Group. It's right across the road from us. It's in Washington, D.C. It's a sister organization with whom we coordinate very closely. Our membership is more or less the same. So the Articles of Agreement of IBRD state that you can't be a member of IBRD unless you're a member of IMF, for instance. So it's a very close organization to us, but is not part of the same organization. Now, we also work in partnership with several MDBs and bilateral aid agencies. And I think the COVID pandemic is one of those areas where the value of partnerships has really shown itself. So as you know, also, we are a shareholder cooperative. We are formed by our member countries. And so we work to help them through the pandemic and to build back better. And they are also part of the decision-making through their representatives on our World Bank board. So it makes the role of any practitioner in the World Bank very interesting because we are lending or providing funding to members, to countries that are also our membership, that also make the decisions in the institution. So I want to start with a bit of background on the bank's overall COVID-19 response. The World Bank is making available up to 160 billion in financing over 15 months. This is going until June 2021. And this financing is tailored towards the health, economic, and social shocks that countries are facing, including 50 billion of IDA resources, this is to the poorer countries, on grant terms and on highly concessional terms. 12 billion, those who follow the World Bank closely would know that 12 billion of that was specifically approved to help countries with the purchasing of COVID-19 vaccines, purchasing and deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. It will also provide, of course, technical support so that countries can prepare to deploy the vaccines at scale. And we do this in collaboration, obviously, with international partners. We have, weekly calls with the Gavi Alliance and the Vaccine Alliance and others. We're also working worldwide to redeploy resources. So we have existing projects, obviously, that we're financing in many of our countries. And when an emergency like this hits, we try and deploy those resources towards that emergency. And so that has been a big part of the work that we've been doing. And the overall aim of this response, really, the COVID-19 response, is to help developing countries strengthen their pandemic response, increase disease surveillance, improve public health interventions, and help the private sector continue to operate and sustain jobs. And so we've been involved in several country operations, which have ranged from helping with cash transfers to poor people, food security. There's a big target on the most vulnerable groups, women and forcibly displaced communities. And we do all this through strengthening health systems, monitoring and prevention, and scaling up social protection. Again, sort of these safety nets that countries have or should have, We're also very concerned about the business community and preserving jobs and procuring medical equipment and supplies. And then next, you'll see this map, which gives a global overview of the bank's COVID-19 projects. It reflects financing for projects that are a part of the COVID-19 Strategic Preparedness and Response Program. This is the SPRP, which is the framework through which the bank is providing support. And this map also shows projects that receive COVID-19 funding through restructurings, redeployment, and reallocation of existing resources. As you can see, the bank currently, as of March 4th of this year, it has 178 COVID-19 projects that are active or completed across 111 countries. And this is for a total of 10.6 billion in financing. And this has all occurred at record pace. You can imagine since the pandemic hit, with all of us working from home and across the world in all our offices, it has been quite an immense effort on the side of World Bank staff, as well, of course, as our member country staff. In fact, last year in May, the World Bank Group's emergency operations to fight COVID had already reached 100 developing countries. And I remember just sitting in my house and we were just chunking them out. And this has reached 70% of the world's population, so quite significant. These projects are spread relatively evenly across all regions. In the Africa region and the MENA country, where my current practice is focused, the COVID-19 response has included financing, it has included policy advice, technical assistance to help countries strengthen pandemic response and healthcare systems and cope with urgent health needs of the pandemic, and support safety net systems, including cash transfer projects. Most recently, our effort, actually the large part of our effort right now is supporting countries in their purchase and distribution of COVID vaccines and strengthening vaccine systems. And we're working closely with partners like COVAX, who you've heard about, which was convened by, it's global partnership for equitable access to vaccines. As well as with the African Union Vaccine Acquisition Task Team and several other groups that are doing whatever they can to get vaccines into people's arms. And so the legal and policy issues have arisen, and these are things that have been new to practitioners like myself and others at the World Bank Group. Obviously, these projects are taking place in a very complex legal and policy environment, with a variety of issues that we at the bank and our member countries have had to take into account. We've had to learn on the fly and meet this moment with new legal and policy issues that have been arising and are still arising up to today. So, there are several legal issues, as we're going to go over quickly. There have been diverse legal responses to the pandemic by our member countries. We've seen also access to justice challenges, including in relation to gender-based violence. There's been huge impacts on commercial and contractual relations. Debt distress and debt management has been, it's been an ongoing issue in our institution, but it's very acute right now for many of our countries. Our countries have also faced labor and employment issues, and obviously health law issues such as testing, medical equipment, therapeutics, and vaccines. We've also had to tackle issues related to data protection and privacy. As you can imagine, an institution like ours is a big target for the NGO community. And so, in many instances, when countries, when there have been issues that have arisen, legal challenges that have arisen in a country, and particular groups of people are unable to get a response from the member country, they turn to the World Bank because they know that we're very sensitive to issues like this and very responsive. And so our policy framework has to be intact to be able to foresee and respond to any of the legal issues that come up. So I want to give a brief overview of some of these issues and then leave some time for questions. So as you can imagine, it's very important for governments to have a strong legal foundation for their COVID-19 response efforts. Countries have enacted a range of responses to COVID-19, but to do so, they generally utilize a number of of legal authority. And we've seen that also in the US, different things that are being triggered legally for emergencies to be declared, whether it's at the federal government or at state level. So we've seen some countries have declared emergencies under their constitutions to enable them to take extraordinary measures. So Ethiopia is one example, which used its constitution to declare a state of emergency in early April of last year. Other countries have relied on existing public health or disaster management laws to impose COVID-19 response restrictions. So we've seen, for instance, in Burkina Faso, which declared a state of health alert under a public health code. And this has enabled it to establish certain restrictions to combat COVID-19. Other countries have enacted new legislation, which have had to pass through Parliament in a quick amount of time. So Ghana, for instance, passed the Imposition of Restrictions Act of 2020, which enabled the government to then impose certain restrictions. Legal foundations are also analyzed by and derived from court decisions in various countries. We've seen courts, people take governments to court to hold them accountable for their COVID-19 response measures. We saw, for instance, last year that the Malawian High Court temporarily enjoined the government from implementing a lockdown due to certain constitutional concerns. And of course, this was taking place in Malawi during a time of political uncertainty with the government, the election of the government having been challenged in court as well. And so we saw the High Court lifting, basically saying it was unconstitutional for the government to impose a lockdown. And then we see an area that's near and dear to our hearts, which is access to justice. The COVID-19 crisis has had a significant impact on judicial systems across the world. Court systems are having to adapt to this new normal of lockdowns, which can occur anytime. And these things are happening already in a very overburdened justice system. So, courts are having to conduct meetings and virtual trials through video conferencing. They're having to use e-filing. They're closing or restricting public access to court buildings. And you can imagine in some countries where they don't have the mechanisms, e-systems in place. I mean, in some countries, we're still working to support them to do that. It's really proven to be quite a challenge, both for the judges, but more critically for people who are waiting for trial, people sitting in jails waiting for trial. So you'll see here, an access to justice graphic here. This has not prevented, and which is really good. It has not prevented, court cases from continuing, right? You have an overburdened justice system, which was already stretched prior to the pandemic, and courts trying to figure out how to move along and get justice done. And so there've been increased backlogs due to COVID-related court closures. There've been surges of litigation around pandemic and reopening related claims. You can imagine that, we're going to talk about employment issues and other business issues, but just a surge in litigation that has occurred. And this is a significant factor to consider as we move forward through and past the immediate COVID crisis. This backlog is really going to continue. An issue that we've been also very concerned about, because our institution sees gender-based violence as a development issue. If half the population of people, and we hear that a third of women are subject to some sort of gender-based violence in their lifetime, if that part of the population is unable to access justice, it's really a big issue for us. So it's a very vulnerable group that we are concerned about. And we've seen that some of the COVID response policies, such as lockdowns, quarantines, stay-at-home orders, and travel restrictions, have in fact increased the risks of gender-based violence, particularly intimate partner violence to women and girls. And this is especially acute in countries where there is no functioning 911 or other similar number to call. So we've seen that there have been surges of incidents of domestic violence, in some countries initially reporting surges of 25 to 30% of an already high number. And it's therefore important to identify policies and strategies to ensure access to justice for survivors of GBV, for instance, by enhancing access to legal services and judicial protective measures during the COVID crisis. Some countries have been very creative in how they've done this, increasing the flexibility and remote capability of judicial systems, increasing judicial services awareness of and responsiveness to gender-specific needs, and engaging in awareness campaigns regarding existing judicial services and their modifications. And this is centered around supporting, enhancing, and building upon existing justice sector mechanisms rather than attempting to create new ones. And it's important to view these issues in the context of other overlapping vulnerable groups such as refugees, migrants, and persons with disabilities, who may also face particular barriers in access to justice. You may or may not know that the World Bank has a specific financing window for countries that are hosting refugees to make sure that the refugees are adequately cared for. And so we see additional layers of vulnerability. Imagine a woman who's subject to GBV within a refugee camp. It really poses very critical issues that we have to think about as we design our operations. And then in this, we've seen also that as you look at businesses that have been impacted by the crisis, there's been a range of approaches by countries to deal with the impacts of COVID-19 on businesses. The COVID-19, this pandemic has severely disrupted commercial and contractual relations globally. Many individuals and companies have been in breach of or unable to perform contractual obligations. And individuals and business tenants have been defaulting on rents because obviously they're not making as much money as they could. Governments themselves are grappling with questions of performance, breach, and payments under contracts with third-party creditors, suppliers, and vendors. And we've seen that some contractual disruptions may be addressed through force majeure provisions, but this all depends on the wording of the nature of the obligation in the contracts. Other remedies may also be available, and so there is likely to be a considerable amount of arbitration and litigation on this topic, which could contribute to the overburdening of justice systems. To deal with this, some countries have adopted contractual standstill laws to temporarily relieve parties from contractual obligations. One example is the Singapore's COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act in 2020, which protects certain contractual parties from lawsuits concerning non-performance or defaults due to COVID-19 for a period of 6 months. The Act provides parties with a space to make necessary adjustments by deferring contractual obligations. It allows them to suspend rental payments for up to 6 months, preventing forfeiture of deposits paid and disallowing insolvency proceedings for 6 months. And in the case of such standstill laws, the parties' contractual obligations, as you can imagine, are not cancelled. They're merely suspended and they must be fulfilled eventually. So there's going to be that crunch time where you have to pay back rent as well as rent that is currently due. And we've seen that there are other legal and regulatory responses that some countries have taken into account. Contractual standstill laws, obviously, which we've just discussed in Singapore and in other countries. We've seen that there's been some temporary suspension of insolvency and bankruptcy regimes. Some countries like Bulgaria, Germany, and Turkey have used that. Relaxing tax obligations and filing requirements. We've seen this in a few countries as well. Albania, Cameroon, Ghana, Poland, Uzbekistan. For example, in Cameroon, the government provided temporary tax accommodation to businesses directly affected by the crisis through tax moratoria and deferred payments. And we've seen also that some countries have instituted corporate compliance waivers and have enabled renegotiation of contracts, including government contracts. And this has been helpful during this period. But all this involves a delicate balancing act of policy concerns. On the one hand, there's a need to act promptly to alleviate economic catastrophe from the effects of COVID-19. But on the other hand, there's a need to protect or restore market confidence and to preserve the freedom of contract, both of which may be affected by such COVID-19 measures. So it's a tough balance that we've seen our member countries having to deal with. I want to talk a bit about debt distress and debt management, which is another pressing issue for the World Bank as an institution, as it is for the IMF and other multilateral development banks. Debt vulnerabilities have increased in recent years in emerging market and low-income countries. The total external debt of low and middle-income countries totaled 8.1 trillion at the end of 2019, of which a third was owed to private creditors. More than half of IDA countries, which is, as I said, the lending arm of the World Bank Group that gives concessional either grants or non-concessional loans to countries, or concessional loans to countries. More than half of those IDA countries today are in debt distress or at a high risk of debt distress. Assessments by the World Bank Group have found that less than half the countries reviewed met minimum requirements for debt recording. So we don't know the full story, right? They're not reporting as they should. And this was prior to COVID. This was by the end of 2019. The COVID pandemic has exacerbated an already very difficult situation in public debt vulnerabilities of many of our countries. The fall in revenue that they've encountered, along with emergency spending, has pushed government deficits and debts in low and middle income countries to the highest levels since the global financing crisis. The pandemic is pushing a growing number of these countries into debt distress. So supporting our poorest countries to fight COVID-19 is the World Bank's most urgent priority. We are deploying unprecedented support to enable countries to focus on responding to the pandemic rather than the repayment of creditors. So the World Bank Group is working to encourage comprehensive debt solutions that involve at least 4 elements. The first is debt suspension. Second is debt reduction. Third is debt resolution. And the fourth is debt transparency. You may have read in the press about the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, otherwise known as DSSI. This is an initiative that was established by G20 countries at the urging of the World Bank and the IMF. It provides eligible countries a temporary suspension of debt service payments owed to their official bilateral creditors. It took effect on May 1st, 2020, and since then it has delivered more than 5 billion in relief to more than 40 eligible countries. In all, 73 countries are eligible for temporary suspension of debt service payments owed to their official bilateral creditors. The G20 group of countries has also called on private creditors to participate in the initiative on comparable terms. The suspension period was originally meant to end on December 31st of 2020, but this has been extended now through June of 2021. We suspect that there will be a further extension of the DSI, and this is really much needed to create fiscal space for economic investments. But some countries still need, beyond this DSSI, which is only with bilaterals, as we've said, countries need help beyond that. And so we've seen the operationalization of a common framework, which is a common framework for debt treatments beyond DSSI. It's intended to help countries with either liquidity or solvency problems, including debt restructuring. There is also the Sustainable Development Finance Policy that the World Bank has put in place, which does a number of things, including debt transparency, debt sustainability, pushing countries to develop policies that help them to sustainably manage their debt. And we've also seen calls for, the issuance of new special drawing rights. And all these things are going to be critical. A comprehensive approach is going to be needed to help countries get out of this debt crisis. This is needed critically for debt and economic challenges. But the most important thing is that vaccines are deployed as fast as possible, because the more the vaccine deployment delays, the harder it's going to be for investors and others to have confidence and for there to be spending in the markets, which would then allow economies to rebound. So really the health response remains the most critical while we are obviously helping countries on all other responses. I'll quickly go to the next issue, which is on employment and labor law issues. And you may also be familiar with some of these in your own practices. But we've seen that there have been, a number of labor and employment issues that have arisen in the last year since we've had these shutdowns. And this has led to a number of government responses and government action to, for instance, reduce or freeze operating costs and wage bills, where developing countries need to pay particular attention to the informal sector of the economy. So we've seen in some countries where we see, or whether it's wage subsidies for citizen employers or businesses affected by COVID-19, or we see benefits being given to small and medium-sized enterprises, and just actions governments are taking to help employers to manage these wage bill issues. We've also seen countries taking measures to deal with uncompensated absences and medical benefits affected by the COVID-19 crisis. And this has taken many different forms. For instance, in Argentina, the Ministry of Labor, Employment and Social Security has granted exceptional and voluntary leave for employees returning from COVID-19 affected countries, specifying that the leave should not affect the employees' regular remuneration and benefits. And all these things add up to sort of keep jobs afloat. We've seen also measures to ensure equity and fairness in hiring decisions, especially with regard to vulnerable groups such as older workers or workers with disability. Guidelines have been adopted on workplace health and safety, and we've seen, that we've also seen guidelines on how or laws or regulations that govern how employers collect, receive and utilize medical information about their employees' status and protect the confidentiality of their medical information. And for these kinds of regulations, it's very important to consider their applicability to informal sectors as well as formal sectors. In the region, one of the regions I work with, which is Africa region, roughly 8 out of 10 people are engaged in low-wage informal employment. And so whenever we're looking at these employment related or wage bill related issues, it's very critical to look at the informal sector as well. Probably one area that has kept us awake is with respect to the health systems of countries. And so I'll talk a little bit about the legal and policy challenges that we've been seeing in the health sector as we respond on the health systems. So I won't go into too much detail on the first one, but I want to indicate a few areas where policy plays a key role in the COVID-19 context. So we've seen, for instance, legal and policy issues on the availability of testing. COVID-19 testing, as you recall, even in the US was a big issue. We've also seen issues on manufacture and trade in medical equipment, which may involve mandatory production laws, regulatory approvals, import and export restrictions, and tariffs. Research, development, and accessibility of vaccines is another critical area, intellectual property issues, and compulsory licensing of vital drugs, for example, as it relates to the TRIPS agreement. With respect to vaccine deployment, like I said, this has been the thing that has been occupying us for the last few months specifically. And this slide is simply meant to indicate the many opportunities for legal, regulatory, and policy issues to arise throughout the vaccine development and distribution process. For example, issues arising relating to availability, accessibility, and efficacy of vaccines, including the potential requirement by some countries of mandatory vaccination. I think you've been seeing and reading of these green cards that are being given in some countries to show that you've been vaccinated. And we've also seen the recurring issue of liability throughout different stages of the vaccine development and distribution process. Overall, the bank's vaccine operations are aimed to support fair, broad, and fast access to effective and safe COVID-19 vaccines for low and middle income countries. And we're partnering, as I said, with the Vaccine Alliance, with COVAX, with the African Union. It has a facility where they're trying to secure vaccines for Africa as well. and absolutely with our member countries on how to strengthen systems and vaccination systems to get vaccines into arms. I want to touch on specifically on an issue that really occupied a number of us for I want to say from about September to up to now, when we started knowing about potential liability issues once vaccines became available. As we all know, the COVID-19 vaccines are being developed and have been developed at an unprecedented speed. And this has involved high risks for vaccine manufacturers, obviously, because they know that they're working at speed. Maybe they haven't done the testing that they would have needed under normal circumstances. And so vaccine manufacturers want to shift the risk to governments. And this has required some creative approaches. Some manufacturers are requiring indemnity clauses. Actually, I should say all manufacturers are requiring indemnity clauses and other limitations of liability in contracts for the supply of vaccines. Some countries are resorting to contractual solutions, while other countries are passing new laws or adjusting their current legislation to address concerns by manufacturers. Some governments are looking at insurance, potential for insurance, but you can imagine that this would involve such high premiums if there was to be insurance given. And so we have here one example of an indemnity clause in a contract with a vaccine manufacturer. This is the advanced purchase agreement between the European Commission and CureVac AG, a vaccine manufacturer. As you can see, these indemnification clauses can be very broad, and they apply to a range of entities. They cover the contractor, the subcontractor, and licensees, contract partners, affiliates, service providers. Basically, everyone through the vaccine development process is protected more or less under such indemnification clauses on the basis of exceptional circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you've seen, here a New York Times article recently, which, highlights the concerns that people are having about these contracts that their governments are signing with vaccine manufacturers. And so, there are concerns from the public about transparency in these processes and the broad nature of these indemnities. And then you see, obviously, other headlines that we have been encountering. This held to ransom headline, which shows concerns about unequal bargaining power of a number of our countries. If you want the vaccine, you have to sign the contract, but you might be signing away everything, And sometimes this unequal bargaining power has slowed down the process or prevented countries from coming to agreement altogether for critical vaccines. Another approach that we've seen has been for countries to pass legislation granting immunity to these vaccine manufacturers. We've seen, for instance, in the US, and one of the reasons the US was able to move very fast is they have the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, the PrEP Act, which excludes claims for products necessary to control a public health crisis. So under this example, the US Department of Health and Human Services must issue a PrEP Act declaration stating that there is an emergency covered by the Act, and then you have the covered persons are granted immunity. Covered persons in this case would be Pfizer and Moderna and others, would be granted immunity from suit and liability under federal and state law with respect to any claim of loss related to the manufacturer. An exception to immunity is given in most cases, and this is, if it involves willful misconduct. But it's otherwise a very broad immunity that's given to vaccine manufacturers. We've also seen no-fault compensation schemes that some countries have engaged in, and some argue that governments should not be held responsible for effects of vaccines bought by the private sector, since the government does not have control over the handling of vaccines and would not have oversight if the vaccines were mishandled. But it is, governments have to again, another balancing act. Do we play hardball and try and avoid these liabilities or indemnity clauses, or do we just take the vaccines? And we also what happened in Europe, in the EU, when they tried to negotiate hard. And as a result, there were significant delays in concluding contracts with manufacturers. So illegal issues have also arisen in relation to the COVAX facility, the COVID-19 vaccines global access, which we all call COVAX. And this COVAX facility is a global mechanism to pool resources and demand for COVID-19 vaccines with the goal of accelerating availability of and equitable access to safe and efficacious vaccines in our poorer countries. I listen a lot to the New York Times daily editorial, and you know, a few weeks ago they covered the origins of COVAX and Bill and Melinda Gates, how they thought, you know, their work over the years led them to be ready to convene partners to think about poorer countries in this vaccine race. And so the World Bank has been working very closely with COVAX on this vaccine effort. And as a result, we've seen through World Bank funding, a few countries already starting to receive COVAX vaccines in recent weeks, and more to come on that. So, you know, we see here an overview of the process to receive COVID-19 vaccines through COVAX. It's co-led by the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, Gavi and WHO, alongside with a delivery partner, UNICEF. In July, very quickly, the Gavi board approved Gavi as the legal entity to administer the COVAX facility. And it also critically established this COVAX AMC. And this is a financing mechanism to accelerate and reserve COVID-19 vaccines to ensure that the lower and middle income economies, which we call the AMC 92 countries, as well as other eligible economies, to have access to COVID-19 vaccines at the same time as wealthier economies. So COVAX looks at IDA eligibility, IDA being the arm of the World Bank Group, and those countries then can have access to these free vaccines through AMC, through COVAX AMC 92. And so it's been a good thing to see countries putting in money, donor countries putting in money into this COVAX facility, so that other countries can have access. We talked about indemnity before, but just to mention here that the COVAX facility similarly requires indemnification of vaccine manufacturers by AMC participating countries through contractual documents or the passing of legislation if required. So even though they're getting free vaccines, they still have to indemnify the manufacturers. Then, in addition, COVAX came up with a no-fault compensation program to compensate individuals in AMC participating countries who suffer serious adverse effects resulting in permanent impairment or death associated with a COVAX vaccine or its administration. This compensation is meant to comprise full and final settlement of any such claims. And this was very critical if countries were going to participate. There had to be some sort of scheme, otherwise the AMC 92 countries would not be able to cope with claims of, like, you know, once anyone is injured with, God forbid, it doesn't happen, but injured as a result of these vaccines. Then moving on very quickly to privacy and data protection concerns. I'm sure you've been thinking about this a lot at Cornell, starting from testing and who has COVID, and now obviously on who has the vaccine. And you know, we've seen this contact tracing and surveillance, either using QR codes and smartphone apps. And really, to complicate this whole thing is that they're not generally accepted international guidelines on the collection, use, and sharing of personal data. And we've also seen very clearly through this process that there is a big digital divide where not everyone has access to the same tools and information through digital means. And so these privacy concerns, as lawyers in the institution, we've really spent a lot of time thinking about how to support our countries and how to support citizens in countries from their data being misused. And so, just a few key takeaways. All these issues are relevant to the World Bank's COVID operations, including what we call policy-based operations, or whether it's social protection projects, vaccine financing projects, or projects supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. And they are also relevant to appraising and mitigating social risks across a range of bank operations. And, I realize we've thrown a lot of information at you during a very short amount of time. So let me just, if you want, give you a few key takeaways from a policy perspective, and then we can move on to the questions. So in the immediate term, it's important for countries to anchor COVID-19 responses in clear legal authority. I think when we've seen countries just, announce lockdowns or close businesses without a sort of clear legal authority, this has led to issues, as we've seen. Very importantly, are regional and international regulatory coordination in a number of areas, whether it is vaccine efficacy, deciding which vaccines should be approved, etc. That sort of coordination is really critical. We have seen key policy developments that are crucial to strengthening justice delivery systems. We have also seen business-specific responses meant to reduce transaction costs and regulatory burdens and ease tax regulations, reporting, etc. We've also seen the impact of pre-existing debt, that debt has had on countries' ability to respond to new challenges. And we've talked about debt suspension, debt transparency, etc. We've seen legal and policy solutions for labor and employment issues have been implemented, are still being implemented as economies reopen and recover after the pandemic. And moving forward, we've seen that it's very important to address data protection and privacy issues, including establishing a legal regime for digital infrastructure and encouraging development of international guidelines on the collection, use, and sharing of personal data. In the medium term, countries may consider adopting specialized laws for diseases and pandemics in order to mitigate some of the legal issues we have identified here. And these laws could cover a wide range of issues. I think as policy makers, as policy students, you can imagine the wide range of topics that could be covered to get us ready for the next pandemic. So, let me stop here and just say that, I hope I have given you a taste of the bank's general thinking, which informs our operational work and can help to inform member countries who are thinking about how to continue to address these issues and hopefully to address them before the next pandemic comes up. So let me stop here and turn it back to you, Cosmas. Thanks.
Thank you, Chief. It's been quite a fascinating highlight of what has been happening in the policy and legal field. And I do know that our audience is ready and itching to ask a few questions. As they articulate their question, maybe you could just give us an insight as to what you mean by special drawing rights and this technical thing called force majeure. It could be quite distancing for many of us who are not maybe experts in law to understand what you mean by special drawing rights and force majeure.
And I have to unmute, of course. So, as others come with their questions, some of you may or may not know, actually, I did not know it until I joined the institution, that we provide our funding to our poorer countries using what we call special drawing rights, SDRs. And essentially what SDRs are is, it's a basket of currencies that the International Monetary Fund, our sister agency, issues. And this resource basically provides a country's central bank with additional foreign exchange reserves. The lending capacity is limited to IMF quotas, and hence, only a fraction of allocated SDR is distributed to emerging and developing countries. But what we are thinking now, as countries are dealing with debt challenges, is that if there is a new agreement on SDR, which would increase basically the issuance of this SDR, that more would be allocated to emerging and developing countries. And it would allow countries which do not use their SDR to lend those resources to IMF to improve IMF's lending capacity. So it's a basket of currencies. I mean, that was a long explanation, but it's a basket of currencies issued by the IMF, and it's accessible to our poorer countries. So if you pull out World Bank, again, World Bank, you'll never see World Bank in our legal agreements. You'll see either International Bank for Reconstruction and Development or International Development Association. The currency you will see in our legal agreements for the International Development Association is the SDR, not the US dollar, not the euro. You will see SDR because it's meant to be, it's a basket of currencies, because we also receive that money in different currencies into the institution. And force majeure, of not many lawyers, I assumed because Cosmas is the lawyer that everyone will know what force majeure is, but essentially it's clauses that are included in contracts. You will see them, those of you who might take out a mortgage or enter into a contract, where if there is something that happens as a result of nature, an earthquake or whatever, then it releases the parties from having to comply with the contract. So it's a force of nature happening, and so you're released from your obligations under the contract.
Thank you for that brilliant answer. And we are open, and we welcome questions for our audience. Just go ahead, unmute yourself, and keep it short so that we can make progress. Thank you.
I can ask for first question. First, thank you so much for coming in, taking your time to give this session. I'm Justin. So we have many fellows in East Asia and the other regions in the Asia Pacific. They are very interested in your session, but it's late night in East Asia, so it's time for them to sleep. So I am sort of asking this question on behalf of them as well. So our fellows come from numerous countries, different background, and even different professional fields and interests. And as many fellows are starting our professional experience after graduation this May, many of us have our own professional objective and goal where we want to settle into. So we are very interested in knowing more about how your past experience working in the East Asia and other Asia Pacific regions helped you transition into your current role, where you are working in regards to the legal and regulatory responses to COVID-19 and regional operations in the East and Southern Africa.
Thanks so much, Justine, and thanks for representing the East Asian colleagues. I spent several years working on East Asia Pacific, traveled extensively in the region, and it's part of the world that's really very dear to my heart. And so, I want to encourage professionals from all regions to as you think about your careers in post this fellowship, the World Bank is one of the institutions. We partner with several others, and we worked very closely with the AIIB while it was being set up. I was Chief Counsel of East Asia at that time, and we shared a lot of past experience in helping them set up the institution. So there are very many institutions that are doing very good work in East Asia and Pacific region. And what I would say, as somebody who's been in the institution, the World Bank, for a long time, that there's been a lot of value for myself, and I would advise all of you to the extent that you can, to get cross-continental experience. I only started working on Africa 3 years ago, but I have been in the institution for 19 years. And so, and I think there was a lot of value in making sure that I have experience from around the world, and I'm able to share my own experience being a Ugandan lawyer in the institution with other regions. So whether it was the time I worked on Europe and Central Asia, or in South Asia and the others, because it's very enriching to be able to carry what I have seen working in a very similar Pacific island in Tonga or in Solomon Islands, where, for instance, youth unemployment is in your face. You arrive on Solomon Island and you see youth doing nothing, and then you read the statistics on gender-based violence and you say, no wonder, if people are doing nothing, they are going to be drinking, and then and to be able to carry that experience and see how we've managed to tackle jobs for youth in that area, and see how that could potentially be borrowed and used in another area, whether it's through law or policy or other aspects. And so just as a general point, I would say we are very much in a global world. And sometimes if you haven't worked in those regions, policymakers will say something like, oh, but it worked in Indonesia. And if you haven't worked in Indonesia, you might cut and paste, but Indonesia is not Uganda, So just that knowledge of different countries and being able to tell what could work and what couldn't work is really critical. So I mean, obviously, I'm very enthusiastic about development work. So I would obviously encourage you to look into, all of you, to look into doing policy work within development institutions like World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Asian Development Bank, IADB. There are several of them out there, but impacting the poor is probably the issue of our time. And so regardless of where you do it, if you're making policies for rich people, to me, that's not impactful. But making policies and working for the poor is I think it's my life calling, and hopefully it's why most of you are doing policy work. Thanks for that question, Justin.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm very interested in this field as well. Would you mind if I connect you further later on for any kind of future questions?
Yes, I don't know if Cosmas put up my email address. I'm really happy to
Please.
We do this quite a bit, so.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Now that I have your permission, I will do so with speed.
So
Can we hear? Yes,
yeah.
Lourdes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Cosmas. Thank you. Excellent presentation. Really very interesting. As you are saying, we have to remember that we need policies to make the growth sustainable and inclusive. I miss a little bit of the presentation because I'm in Cayuga Heights. It's very, very windy, and the light went off for a while. So sorry, maybe if you have already said that. So how do you see, okay, there is a lot in the press about Chinese investments in Africa, and I'm the director of the Emerging Markets Institute, and that's one subject that we monitor and we look at it. So how do you see, from the World Bank perspective, from an emerging markets perspective, how do you see, there has been a lot of noise about Chinese investments now, the vaccine diplomacy, China is exporting huge millions of vaccines everywhere, Latin America, Africa. How do you see that? How do you see the influence? How do you see? Are they partners? Are they behaving like before US and Europe? So how do you see that?
So that's a good question. And, China is a member country of our institution, obviously, and one of the 5 largest shareholders of the World Bank. They've been a strong partner and continue to be. And one thing I think that shocks people is that China is also one of the big borrowers from the World Bank. And why it shocks people is China doesn't need money, right? It's not borrowing because it needs money. As I mentioned, I've worked on China for several years. They used to say to us, we learn through lending. So they knew that if they're going to learn, they need to be in the game borrowing from the institution, because that's when we will put our experts on the ground. And they borrow in a very clever way. They will do one project in one province, and that's it, and then replicate in every other province. So a very, very efficient way of using funds. So we consider them a very critical partner to our institution. Now, when it comes to China as a donor or as a lender or as an investor, it has been a very interesting relationship. Because we have that lending relationship with them, we're able to engage in these conversations with them on whether the way they are lending to countries around the world is actually sustainable, is both from an environment and social perspective, but also from a debt perspective. And over the last few years, it has that conversation has really intensified, and whether it was a product of the times with, China, or maybe the debt had reached, levels of proportion that nobody could ignore anymore. There's been a lot of pressure on China, both from our institution, but also from bilaterals, to reopen those contracts that they have with countries, to make them transparent, to make in terms of security that they have for those loans. I mean, you read in the press as much as I do, in a number of our countries, in Africa specifically, where the security given for Chinese loans could be anything from the airport to the water utility. And so giving a loan and taking as security an airport is really it's a national security risk. It's many things. And so I just want to say they have been very open to these conversations. They've been at the table. They also have a geopolitical reason for why they want to be there, and the respect they have in the world and in our countries. So they don't want to be excluded, if you want. So they've been, I've found that in all the conversations, they've been willing to participate. So my China work has followed me to Africa, because in a number of our countries, there've been a lot of conversations about either they renegotiate the loans, or they forgive debt or suspend debt. And we have been seeing a lot of that in the last few months. I mean, one challenge, Loris, that you will have seen is when you talk about China, it's very confusing. Is it the country? Is it the China Development Bank? Are they the same thing? It's so many entities, and you wonder, are they all one? So there are many layers of conversation going on, and all I'll say is the bank is extremely involved in that conversation, and China, I think, has, because of our long partnership, have been very willing to allow us into the room to have that difficult conversation.
Thank you. Next question, please. We want it very interactive. Yes. Tiffany, you want to ask a question?
Sure. One of my questions that I've been wondering is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot of new laws and regulations, as you mentioned in your presentation. And I was wondering around if you've seen different ways that countries have started producing laws, if there's been new ways of working to be able to make laws come around faster, and how you see countries continuing to use those techniques in the future.
Yeah, so Tiffany, this has varied very much from country to country. I think one thing with politics being what it is, because lawmaking is very much a political process, countries have avoided passing new laws where they can and tried to work through existing laws. But as my presentation highlighted, we've seen a number of instances where they have passed new laws. And this has really varied. In some instances, yes, it has gone through one house, both houses of parliament. Some have simply used existing, like I mentioned, I think in Ethiopia, for instance, because the constitution already has a provision for a state of emergency. They declared a state of emergency, and and the existing law allows them to do things, and some would argue that they go beyond what the law said, but it has really depended on country to country. In Ghana, they did pass a new law which went through Parliament, and I think because this pandemic was of a nature that everyone was impacted, you know, it has been a bit easier maybe in some cases, in some countries, for those laws to be passed, but it has also been hard in some cases. So in Malawi, for instance, as I mentioned, they challenged the authority of the president to issue a lockdown, which he was saying he was doing under the Public Health Act, existing Public Health Act, and that was shot down by the Constitutional Court. What we do advocate for, what we think works the best, is if there is a legal framework. So whether it's an existing law or a new law, there has to be a legal framework. Otherwise, you get into the realm of authoritarianism, and who knows, it might flow from a pandemic to the next emergency, and you know, it creates a precedent for doing anything anytime. So the answer is it depends, but and we've seen a whole range of the way countries have used the tools that they have.
Thank you. Any other question? But while our audience puts together their ideas as to the next question, I was also wondering whether you could share a little more insight about the relationship between, say, the World Bank and the World Health Organization, or the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and such other institutions that intersect with the World Bank's policy development activities over time, and how they have synergized in the context of this reality to find sustainable answers, and what prescriptions they might be thinking of, you know, going forward from the lessons we have learned. Yeah.
So this is where my legal geekiness comes in. So in our articles of agreement, we have a provision that essentially requires us to collaborate with other international organizations. And very early, when the institution was formed, the question became, what does that mean? You know, and so we came up with an arrangement with the United Nations that says that we pay due regard to UN, you know, Security Council, other regulations, and so our relationship, for instance, with the UN, of which we are a specialized agency, by the way, another fun fact, we are a UN specialized agency, doesn't mean that whatever the UN says, we have to do. In fact, that arrangement that we had to enter into with them very quickly was to say, no, we are not going to do, because UN is a political organization. We are an apolitical organization, according to our articles. We do not take politics into account. And so, yeah, Cosmas says in quotes, when I was at Harvard, I wrote a paper about that. But little did I know I was going to join the bank. But essentially, we are not political. We are not supposed to take politics into account. And so when we start getting pressure from member countries to say, for instance, why are you lending to Cambodia, you know, in the past under the Khmer Rouge, why are you lending to Cambodia? We say we are not political. As long as our funds can reach the poor people, you know, we're going to be there. And I think that has allowed us to remain in partnership with China, while at the same time being in partnership with the US, or with Russia at the same time as the US, because of our apolitical nature. And it's a critical thing for us. And so to allow, let's say, UN General Assembly, you know, statements to dictate who we lend to and not lend to was a big issue for us. And we saw it right away and decided we are not going to do it. That's not what being in relationship means. So we pay, according to what we agreed, we pay due regard to UN Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7. And what happens in practice typically is, let's say the UN says that, you know, sanctions have to be issued against, you know, pick a country, Iran, Syria, or whoever. We pay due regard to that. And there's a practical part of that element, which is if we are to then turn around and start lending money to Syria, where will that money even pass? Which bank is going to take money for Syria right now? And then our own economic assessments will say, we're not sure because the government is spending most of its budget on military and security, which is not within our mandate. How can we be sure that our funds will actually be used for the purposes intended, whether it's for COVID vaccines or for things like that? So we keep ourselves aware of this, of UN General Council, what the General Assembly says, but more specifically what the Security Council issues. But it's not binding on us. We definitely make our own decisions. That said, partnerships are critical for us. And so that's why I mentioned right from the start that IMF is a huge partner. All the multilateral development banks are partners. And many times, in fact, we co-finance projects. And so with AIIB, for instance, we have an agreement, it's public, which I had the privilege of negotiating years ago when AIIB was formed, which says that we will help AIIB in designing projects with countries and supervising projects, because they did not have the staff to do that. And they pay us a fee to be able to carry out that function. So those partnerships are critical. Our balance sheet is it's big, but not that big to meet the demands of the whole world. So funding from everybody is important. But I'll maybe end this by saying that the leadership of countries, our member countries, is so critical. Because in many of our countries, you have every donor, could come with a different priority area. Climate change, and a bilateral it might be human rights, it might be infrastructure, many different things. So if a country is not strong and has a clear development path, they could be confused by all this aid that they're getting and not have a clear strategic goal. And so we emphasize very strongly country ownership, and we try and bring the partners around a country strategy. So we end up playing a lead role, if you want, in many countries and be the lead donor with the country at the driver's seat. Because we found out very fast, especially after the 1980s structural adjustment by our institution, that trying to impose policies on countries is a sure way of failing, because some of those policies that were passed in the 1980s. We've been open about it. We are also a very self-critical institution. So if you Google structural adjustment in the World Bank, there's a very negative connotation to it. But that's what we did at that time when we thought fast liberalization in countries was good, but it wasn't probably done in a way that the countries owned it and the dividends were felt by the people. So we no longer do that. We work in partnership. We let the country be in the driver's seat, and all the donors need to come around the country.
Thank you. Next question, please. Chuma, are you still there?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sorry, sorry. Again, so as I said, the light went. So I don't know if you already have covered, but this program of debt, how do you say, DSSI of IMF, and so this program you say it's a great program, but then, as you know, the credit rating agencies, what they do, as soon as you start, and that was the case of Kenya, then they lower your credit rating. So which means that then your loans become more expensive. What is the bank doing in regarding to this terrible subject? Very difficult.
Yeah, that was very, very difficult for some countries. And in fact, a number of countries took a long time to sign on to DSSI for that very reason. I think that the rating agencies, their impulse is to look at it as debt restructuring, which means that you must have a problem, and so they downgrade the country. So the bank has been actively in dialogue with rating agencies, Moody's and others, to make sure that this doesn't happen. And so I think you've seen that it hasn't continued to happen. It's just a suspension. It's because of COVID. And so this downgrading of countries is not useful. That said, aside from DSSI, countries are defaulting on other loans. Because DSSI was really meant to be with bilaterals, whether it's DFID, China was a big one as well. But it did not cover a country's loan to Standard Chartered or to whoever. So if they default on those loans, then the rating agencies are going to downgrade them. So yes, you picked up on a big point, and internally in our institution, there was a lot of debate among economists and debt management specialists saying, why are we making countries take on this DSSI if it's going to result in that? But I think we're now hopefully in a good place with the rating agencies, and there's more understanding.
Thank you. I do know you had hinted on financial inclusion, particularly for vulnerable communities, women, small businesses, many of whom have been devastated by this pandemic. I was wondering whether there are policy recommendations to encourage financial inclusion, since we have discovered that it's part of disaster preparedness and management in the face of COVID pandemic, or indeed any other crisis that might occur in the economy.
Yeah, Cosmas, financial inclusion is something we've been, it's been part of our lending program for many years in all our countries. And a big emphasis on that has been with women, because I think all the studies show that for some reason banks don't think that women can pay them back. So the access to finance for women has been a problem over the years. And so our projects, so speaking specifically right now about Africa specifically, but there have been many in Bangladesh and all over the world, is when we are providing financing towards small and medium-sized enterprises, we include as one of the criteria that there should be a certain percentage that's going to these vulnerable groups. It might vary from country to country, but if countries want to come to us for that sort of financing, that's one of the things we are extremely serious about. So we've seen, as a result of bank projects, more women-owned businesses around the world. Disabilities, it might not be where it should be, but people with disabilities, it's very much encouraged that they get access to this financing, and hopefully we'll keep seeing more of that. But I think that's the beauty about an institution like ours. We are not just a lender waiting to be paid back. We are making sure that there is equity and that all poor people and disadvantaged groups are included. But it's never perfect. It's never perfect, and that's why sometimes you will see if a project goes bad, or then you see the World Bank in the press, and we respond really. We have very thin skin as an institution. We're very quick to then respond and correct those mistakes.
Excellent answer. Yeah. So we still have time for more questions. I would like the audience to participate. I still have a lot of questions to ask, but audience participation is more important to us. So while you formulate your question, I was also going to take you a little to the side of, pivoted a little to the side of sustainability. You recall there was this case of JAM and IFC, International Finance Corporation, and it had elements of sustainability and environmental damage and all that. Has that led to any new policy framework at the World Bank in relationship to some of the projects that the World Bank is participating in, either in a supervisory capacity or as a lender, in any part of the world. I'm just saying, has that led to a new framework, or how is the institution responding to some of these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Cosmos. I see that Tiffany also had a question. Maybe let me take those two, and then I'll respond.
Sure. My question was going back to the issue of equity. I was wondering, with the COVAX scheme, are there any clauses or, pressure to make sure that vaccine distribution is equitable and reaches marginalized communities?
Thanks, Tiffany. So let me start with that question, and then I'll end with JAM versus IFC. So actually, I was just in a board meeting just before this. It ended exactly at noon. I left 10 minutes before to connect on a project in Tunisia and a project in Ethiopia for vaccines. And that was one of the questions, our board of executive directors constantly is asking about the equity of distribution. And in Ethiopia specifically, the interesting question was, will refugees be included? Because there is right now a conflict in the Tigray region in Ethiopia. And as a result of that infighting, there have been some refugee camps that were attacked by Eritrean troops. You can read in the press, it's the facts are still emerging. And so a very big concern about, will refugees be excluded from getting vaccines, and how are you going to reach refugees if they're now all scattered? The bank and COVAX has been more at the country level. We need not just the US and UK to get vaccines, we need small Chad and all the countries around the world, Tonga, and to also get vaccines. So COVAX is trying to get the vaccines to the country. The bank, WHO, and other organizations have been working with the countries on vaccine acquisition frameworks within the country. Who is going to get vaccines? And so most countries have done more or less what the US has done, which is the older population, to begin with, then essential workers in health, education, and the rest. And we have to agree with those plans before we can provide financing for vaccines. So that has been a driving force. I have to say, on the whole, countries have wanted to do this. So it's not as if, the policymakers in countries are trying not to vaccinate the older population. They've wanted to do this. I think the challenge comes, and you probably read on Twitter, don't ask me why people use Twitter so much, but in Lebanon, the vaccines arrived, and immediately there was a lot of social media about, parliamentarians are getting the vaccine first, and they were not in the vaccine plan, and why are they getting the vaccines first? And the World Bank had to immediately issue a statement saying, if you deviate from the plan you told us you were going to follow, we're going to suspend disbursements. Now, between us, imagine suspending disbursements of vaccines. And so that means everyone suffers. We were not really going to try and do that. We were trying to put pressure on the government to stick to the plan. So it's a big deal in vaccine distribution that there is actually a plan and an order in which countries follow the vaccine distribution within them. Then on JAM versus IFC, one thing to IFC, as I've mentioned, is part of the World Bank group. I don't work for IFC, neither does Paige. They have their own legal department. IFC is a separate legal entity with separate articles of agreement, and they were sued. However, we are all in the World Bank group, so when it hits the press that IFC is being sued, it is the World Bank is being sued. So, but just for the record, two different organizations, two different articles of agreement. And so that case, as you know, went all the way to the US Supreme Court. It was a case in India. It had to do with fishermen, and because they were not able to get the responsiveness they had wanted from IFC, they decided to bring the case in the US. The lower court said IFC has privileges and immunities, should not be suing them here. The organization that was representing them appealed anyway until they got to the US Supreme Court, which essentially said that under one of the US laws that potentially IFC could be sued. They didn't say they could be sued, but they said they could be sued, but they could also be protected by their own articles of agreement. And in fact, that has been consistently held, that the articles of agreement of IFC, World Bank, IMF, others, says we are immune from suit. So the case ended on, or is being argued on an immunity point. And in fact, now the courts have agreed with something else the Supreme Court said, which is this: there's no jurisdiction in the US for a case that was in India. So the complainants arguing that IFC is headquartered in the US, so the damage was done in India. So it ended up on those technical arguments. But I will end by saying we have strong accountability mechanisms within our institutions, both in IFC and the World Bank, and there are areas where we could improve, and people can come and complain, and we will take it seriously. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, deep, resonating, and covering the entire field in a sense. That overview is something we can take home, and from there we can continue our search for sustainable answers to some of the most important policy issues of our time. I would want to thank the editorial board for supporting all the efforts to put this together. I would want to thank especially our speakers, Chief Musiime and Paige, who joined us to make this possible. I also recognize the director of the Emerging Markets Institute here at Cornell, at Johnson School of Business, Lourdes Casanova. She's been quite a mentor for many of us who are fellows of the Institute. Understanding the intersection between policy and businesses and how it all has ramifications for development and society. We are excited to continue these conversations and dialogues and deliberations because we do know that it is in the fountain of dialogues and deliberations that ideas for development and policy making are crystallized. We won't shy away, we will continue the conversation. And we thank everybody who came. And I'm sure you can also listen to these asynchronously at your time. Perhaps I should also say that we are at a moment in history when our critical role, critical interventions as individuals and institutions is indispensable to human flourishing. And maybe that's enough reason for us to give our commitments to this search for answers, to these interventions for development. Join us next time when you see our advert. We will still be reaching you live from Ithaca, New York, from Cornell Institute for Public Affairs. And please do keep in touch with us if you have any questions. Thank you, Chief Musiime and Paige, for joining us, for making this possible. When we call on you again, please do join us. And if our fellows reach out to you, please, I do know that you have crucial business, crucial institutional engagements, but make our time to respond to them, and we will be grateful. And yes, please, if you ever stop by in Ithaca, ask us to take you out for a coffee. We'll be happy to do so. Thank you for joining us. Please join us next time at Cornell Policy Review, Issues in Public Policy Dialogue. I am Cosmas Museum. I'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Cosmas.
Yes.
Have a great weekend, all of you. Thank you very much,
Thank
Sheila.
you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye now.
Absolutely.